my mother stayed in New Jersey, which was a real mystery to her family, why she didn't pack up her 2 young daughters and move back to Sweden, which would have meant a very different life for us, though I'm very close to my Swedish family. Religiously, my parents were nominally religious when I was born. I was christened in the Methodist church around the corner from our home. My mother started attending an Episcopal church when I was with her as a young child, and it was because divorce in those days was rather scandalous. This was the early 1960s, and she was an immigrant, quite beautiful, working hard, and it was hard for her to find people that would accept her, right? But there was this church, an Episcopal church, where there were 2 other divorced women. And I became friends with their children, and she became friends with them, and we found a community there. I can't say spiritually it took. I went to go live with my father when I was about 11, a rather nasty custody battle that had consequences going forward. And I came to faith, a conscious faith in Jesus, as sort of a wanderer as a teenager, and friends inviting me to join their church, which was, the first one was probably a Baptist church, very theologically conservative, with an altar call, and then later another non-denominational church that took me in. And I really loved the people, loved what they said about Jesus, loved the idea of Jesus wanting to be, the language of that era, and maybe it still is accepting Jesus into your heart, you know, and that sounded like a really lovely thing. My heart felt, whenever I thought of my heart, it didn't seem like a happy place, and so to have Jesus there. So I was all in, you know, I really was in. The problem for me, even at that age, was that, you know, you come to the altar, you accept Jesus, and you're part of the community, and everyone's really, really happy. But I was wondering, like, you know, sort of that question, is this it? You know, I wasn't sure it had taken. Like, I wasn't sure enough had happened, because I still felt very much myself. And, but nonetheless, I knew from that moment on that I wanted to be a follower of Jesus, and have been ever since, although my life has taken several twists since then. Fast forward, I wound up back in New Jersey. My father's family kind of fell apart, and I wound up back in New Jersey, and many of the questions I'd been struggling with about the narrowness of the path we were on, and the fact that we were all on it and every other unfortunate person needed to be brought in, otherwise the consequences for them were eternal and horrible. I could never get my brain around that. It doesn't make sense to me. But I didn't know how to talk about that, because I loved these people and they loved me, and they were giving me a lot of the things that my family wasn't. So I wasn't interested in having an argument. I was just trying to figure it out. But I realized that they were not conversation partners that I could have this with. And an Episcopal priest of my mother's church helped me in ways that, I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for him. And the way he allowed me to imagine a God and a relationship with God that had some breadth to it, and some generosity, and an openness to explore things both intellectually and spiritually. So that's a big part of who I am. It's not the only part. I have journeyed far and wide across the spectrum of Christianity in my young adult life. Worshipped as a Roman Catholic in college, worked for the Methodists after a while. You asked about accountability, which I think is such a great question, and I always felt hugely accountable to something. And I wasn't quite sure what. This internal accountability, the sense of God. I discovered injustice as a thing. I discovered how cruel and unfair the world could be by association when I was in college. And that kind of blew open my mind, and I wanted somehow to be a part of something that wasn't that. And so I found myself hanging out with Catholic worker people in the US. This was during the Central American Wars, and being inspired. You my age, I can see, those nuns and priests that just stood for something so dramatic and beautiful and brave. How am I doing? It's okay?
I want to explore with you a little bit about how you've told that story, because in the first part of your remarks just now, you talked about, these are my words, not yours, you talked about emotional deprivation, family breakdown, isolation, dislocation geographically, and a no fixed abode spiritually or devotionally. And yet, then you get to college and you talk about injustice as something that other people experience.
Right.
So the fashion today is to center oneself and say how much I've suffered and how much the world owes me, but you haven't told that story. So tell us about how you found an identity that wasn't based on the ghastly things that people did to you.
I don't know. But I don't want to, part of it was, I thought there was something wrong with me, right? I didn't feel like it was my fault necessarily, but I'm not constitutionally oriented toward blaming other people for my circumstances. And I've been I've obviously done lots of therapy. I wound up, I was in seminary by the time I was 24, and which was really young for me at the time, and I was a hot mess, actually. But it never translated into what the world had done to me. And perhaps it was because I never, for all the things you listed, I never went hungry, right? I was never homeless. People took me in. When I returned to my mother, she was in a really amazing place in her own life, and I felt lucky. So I guess it just never, it didn't enter my head that way. And the injustice of the world as I came to experience it, both vicariously and in witnessing, I just felt that was the bigger problem.
So 24, you go to seminary and you feel in yourself quite a young 24.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to say you really are a classic Episcopalian because you've already been a Catholic and a Baptist and a Methodist.
Right, right. And by the way, I liked parts of them a whole lot more than I liked the Episcopal Church. I really loved and so, it was like, I don't know why, but I just kept on coming back to the Episcopal Church, and it felt like, okay, this is your home, right? So, like most Episcopalians, I think.
But it's one thing to go along to an Episcopal Church now and again.
Yeah.
It's another thing to become a public representative of that denomination, which,
right.
As you say, you actually like parts of the other denominations more. And while not everybody accepts this responsibility, most clergy assume their job is to say nice things about the institution that pays them rather than to slag it off all the time. I'm just saying. So that's a lot to take on at 24 when you've got a lot of backstory already, and there's a lot wrong with the world, which you've already discovered in your student days, and yet you are becoming a public propounder of something that you perhaps, would it be fair to say, only half understand?
Absolutely, half would be generous. Well, here's the thing. I was working and working with various justice groups in college that were mostly Roman Catholic or Quaker. I wanted to go with the Catholics on some sort of mission, and it turned out you had to be Catholic. And I wasn't. I don't know why. I mean, it didn't occur to me like I could convert. I just wasn't. But the Methodists said, well, we'll take you. And I said, I want to go to Central America. And they looked at me and they said, there's no way we're sending you to Central America. You would get eaten alive. But we will send you. We have this wonderful domestic program. It was a 2-year mission program. And they sent me to Tucson, Arizona. And I worked among the poor, which were mostly migrants coming from what we now call the Rust Belt of the U.S. I mean, all of those industries closing down in the 80s, and immigrants coming up from the Central American wars. So I got to work hands-on with them. But I also, for some reason, knew I wasn't a Methodist either. So I started attending an Episcopal church. And when I knocked on the door of ordination, and I'm very different from a lot of the people who come to me saying they want to be ordained. The people who come to me usually say, well, I don't really want to be, but God keeps on bothering me. Give me a break. And I was like, if you don't want this, darling, it's not going to work. And partly that's my own experience, right? You have to really want this. I wanted this so badly. So when I was accepted into the ordination process, I felt someone had given me, like, I just won the lottery. I was so grateful. And I am still. So that's how I felt. Now, all the complexities, all the brokenness of our church, and I know it better now than I ever have. But it doesn't mean very much if you don't love the church. I mean, like, why? So that's been the tension of my ordained life, the gift and the burden.
So in your book, How to Be Courageous, which you wrote before January of this year, published a couple of years ago, you have different chapters that talk about deciding to stay and deciding to start. So the title of this series and tonight's address is Here I Stand, and it strikes me if you stand somewhere, you have to be confident of what you're standing on.
Right.
And you have to know what you're standing on. And you have a chapter called Deciding to Stay. And you say an interesting thing, which is societal forces work against long-term commitments. Mm-hmm. So could you say a little bit about what it means to stay? Staying is one of the 7 commitments of our Nazareth community, staying with. And the only reason it's a commitment is it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people.
Right.
So what does staying mean for you?
It came to me after a season when most of the dramatic decisions of my life involved going, leaving, lots of movement, lots of change, which I associated both with faithfulness and with drama and excitement. And so it was in my late 20s, early 30s, when I began to realize that in many ways the drama was slowing down. We were married by then, Paul and I. We had 2 children by the time I was 31. We had a house and a mortgage and 2 jobs, and it caught me by surprise how uncomfortable all of that had began to feel. Now I knew the cost of family disruption and divorce. My father had been divorced 4 times. My sister divorced 4 times. I mean, divorce was just sort of normative for me. Paul, on the other hand, comes from, Paul's family is like the Rock of Gibraltar, stability, and can't imagine why I was attracted to that, but here we are. And, but existentially it was unfamiliar. It was a real crisis, a couple of crisis points at that time, both vocationally and in marriage. And the urgency or the sense of call came to me, or the sense to stay, came to me more vicariously than of my own insight, in that I just began to read or come across people who had made a commitment to stay or impressed upon me the importance of stability, both for my children, wanting them to have a stable life, but also having the sense that certain things weren't going to be possible if I was always moving. And maybe, and I'll say this too, we spent a year, our first year in marriage, we were in Honduras. We went back to Honduras, we went to Honduras to live among abandoned kids in a home for the Episcopal Church. And when we went to Honduras, I mean, I felt like I was making the biggest, most generous commitment of my life. We were going for a whole year, you know, a year. And as we were living through that year, it felt like an eternity until the last 2 months. And as we were getting ready to leave, I just got here. And I knew we were leaving. But I also realized that within a couple of years we'd be forgotten. And that memory stayed with me when we were in Toledo, Ohio at the time, you know, the center of the universe. But I knew that I had some things I had to learn by staying. And so a lot of the chapter is both my own story, but also people who have chosen to stay at great cost, but what benefits that gave other people by virtue of their stability. So there's something very sacrificial about it, very lovingly sacrificial, often invisible to others. And then also the gifts that come to us that are not possible if we don't allow ourselves to go deeper. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. And then you decided to start. You quote somebody as saying, you can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. Could you tell us about moving from staying to starting?
E.L. Doctorow wrote that, a great passage about writing, which I lean on every week as I try to write, that you don't have to have the destination in mind, you just have to kind of keep going. One of my more dramatic decisions to stay came as a result of disappointment. I had really wanted another position that I came in second for, and it was a real blow. And because I had been in my position for about 10 years, and that was sort of the rhythm of that community, they were all kind of expecting me to go too, or the question was like, when are you going? When's the next position going to come up? All of those things. And I realized that I had to answer that question pretty quickly, otherwise nothing was going to happen. Like everything would be about whether I was staying or going. And so I talking to Paul and a few leaders, I basically said to the church, look, how about if I just commit to you publicly that I will stay for another 5 years, right? I'm at 10, we're going to go to 15, and we're not going to talk about it for another 5 years. And so we did that. And right around that same time, when I made that decision, I had this sense that I was also being invited to start on a journey. And I wasn't quite sure what it was, except it had to do with building up some skills inside me and some resources so that if ever I were invited into a position like the one I was turned down for, I would be ready for it. But I had a sense it was going to take some time. And I didn't have all the pieces. And the first step that came to me was, okay, I'm going to sign up for I was at my seminary, the head of the Doctor of Ministry program said, why don't you get a Doctor of Ministry? I said, okay, I'll get a Doctor of Ministry. I'll go to this course. I will do this thing. I'll take this next step. But I had no idea or no guarantee, certainly, that it would wind up with me standing here. It was one step after another, after another. And then I began listening to people around me who were doing much the same thing. I write in the book about a woman in our congregation who basically announced to me that she was going to fulfill her lifelong dream of being a nurse. And she was in her mid-30s, the mother of 3 children. She barely graduated from high school. And she was going to become a nurse, which meant starting out with remedial courses part-time and then getting into, a small community college, and then getting into nursing school. And all the while she was doing this, we had forgotten, all of us, that that's what she was doing, because she was going about her life, raising her kids, being involved in the church. And, 10 years later, she was a nurse. And 5 years after that, she was the head of the obstetrics nursing, you know what I mean? But like, I knew her when she just said, I'm gonna do this. And I started listening to those kinds of stories and how informative it is to be willing to take the first step and then the next, and then the next. I think it was Carl Jung who said, if you do that, if you tend to, and this is a beautiful phrase, if you tend to the next and most necessary thing, you will always be on the path of the Holy Spirit, right? And I think that's a really helpful thing when it's not clear what's up ahead. But if you can see the next step, sometimes you can make a whole journey.
So let's skip a couple of chapters, and you're the Bishop of Washington, D.C. So that sounds very grand, doesn't it? And many people will have been to Washington National Cathedral, which it may not be, but thinks of itself as the most important cathedral in the world. And yet your denomination is, what, 0.5% of the population or something like that? You've got the big posh title. When coming into that role, 2011, those happy times, what did you think you were doing?
Well, I wasn't a likely winner of that election. There were several people who had far more impressive credentials. I was a parish priest in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was a nice-sized congregation, maybe half the size of St. Martin's. It had grown in my tenure. It was pretty plucky and interesting. I loved the people. I was proud of the work we did. And as you said, the Diocese of Washington, when it was advertising for its next bishop, made it very clear that it was a very, capital V, important, capital I, diocese, capital D. Very important diocese. And it needed a very impressive bishop. So I was reading all of that, and I was reading about the demographics, and there were some real resonances for me. And then there was this little part that was buried, about three sentences in a paragraph, that acknowledged that very few of the churches of the diocese were thriving, and that the next bishop would need to make congregational vitality a priority, amidst all the 70 other priorities that it listed in the profile. And I decided that if that were true, then I had a chance, because that's what I had dedicated my life to. And that's what I would do in the Diocese of Washington. I would dedicate my life to the thriving of the congregations. And so that's what I talked about. Every time I was asked a question, I just talked about the congregations and about how I wanted to commit to their well-being. I had the good fortune of being on the other end of a pendulum swing, because my predecessor had spent a lot of his ministry on the global stage, which is very important and very impressive, but the diocese was beginning to feel neglected. So my message resonated in a way that probably wouldn't have had he not been my predecessor. And so I was elected on a mandate that was not very glamorous at all, and I was determined, actually, to keep the public side of my role to a minimum, less than 10%. And I did, actually, for a long time. I accepted no outside invitations. I stayed in the diocese. I had, and by the way, the cathedral at that time, there had been an earthquake. I don't know if you remember that, but there was an earthquake in 2011, and that became the metaphor for the Episcopal Church and that cathedral. And it turned out the cathedral was financially in shambles, its leadership was a mess, and it was resented by all the other congregations in the diocese, right? So we had a lot of just work to do, and that's what I did. I wasn't, and I disappointed a lot of people because I just didn't play, with one exception, actually two. And someone had given me the advice to say, look, you're going to have to pick a couple of issues to be known for. So pick them. and stay with them and get really good at them, right? So a given was full inclusion of LGBTQ plus people. That was part of our congregation in Minnesota. It was a big part of the Diocese of Washington. There was a lot happening in the country around that time. So that was kind of a given. And I was very comfortable with that because that had been my whole ministry. I wasn't sure what the others were going to be until December of 2012. And that's when a person walked into an elementary school in Connecticut and murdered 30 children and their teachers. And the dean at the time and I made a public commitment. And there was actually a sense of momentum, you know, like we're going to do it this time. Obama had just been reelected. There was a sense of mandate. He had control. The Democrats had the control of both houses. We thought, you know what, we are going to push through legislation that's going to stop this madness. We're going to do it. And in fact, well, we didn't. It didn't happen. But that became the other issue for me in those years. And so I had a public voice, but it was small. And obviously it's grown a bit since then, but that's how I started.
Well, let's fast forward again to events of the last 12 months. We find ourselves with Who Knew America Has a King? Who's also a kind of spiritual leader as well. Not necessarily the role model of all spiritual leaders. And suddenly you can't keep silent. So before we get into you standing, what is happening in America? What is happening in America? What has happened and what is happening? It's the question we're all asking. It would be too simplistic to say that this was something that happened overnight. This has been building for a very long time. And the seeds of all that we are seeing the fruition of have been planted in American soil. Some of it at its founding. I mean, there are certain things that are true about the contradictions of America that play themselves out historically and contemporaneously. So there's that. I find my greatest insights when I try to understand what's happening now, actually by looking back. And the period of history that I look back to is the time after our Civil War and a period known as Reconstruction, in which formerly enslaved Black Americans were granted enormous, just doors opening, and Black citizens took the reins of their lives in a way that was just astonishingly unprecedented on the one hand. And then another major force being the need to rebuild and reindustrialize the South. And a change in political party that was favorable to Reconstruction to one that was favorable to the South. And the loyalties in Washington and the desire to make peace in the country, not to mention the Indian Wars going off to the west, resulted in essentially the re-enslavement of whole populations by vagrancy laws. And vagrancy laws allowing people to be arrested almost basically for standing in the streets, and then being sold out as peonage workers to the industrialists who were rebuilding the South. And it was a horrible time, most of it happening under the radar, most Americans unaware. And then the systematic stripping away of all the rights that had been gained and that Blacks had enjoyed for a very brief time.
And all of that happened from about 1880 to 1920, unabated, and rarely discussed. And by the way, I was a history major in college, and it was something I was never taught, right? So there is this kind of amnesia that American society perpetuates in its educational system, that we just don't talk about these things. So when I think about what's happening now, there are a lot of parallels, right? We've been in a similar place before. And while that's on one level helpful, for several reasons it's helpful for me. Number one, it says there is a way out. We got out of it before, and the people who got us out, starting with some of the bravest people in the world whose names we don't know because they were all happening well before the, what we call the civil rights movement. So these would be like Martin Luther King's grandparents, right? And their courage. And some white leaders across the country as well. I mean, there was change, right? But it was hard-won, it was generational, it was incremental. Sadly, it was assisted by wars, right? And what wars open up for people. All of which to say is, like, I don't know what's happening in America right now. I just know that it's not a new story. It's part of our story. It's part of it's part of the story of America, alongside all the other things that you and I love about the best of America. And for some reason, we're here now again, or for the first time in a whole new, much more dangerous age. And I have to ask myself every day, well, okay, what are the options? Like, what do I do? And I have to tell you, a whole lot of our friends, there was a lot of fighting and protesting and during the first Trump administration, right? Because we thought this was an aberration, and we thought, we were going to take our country back, right? And I guess we did, partially, but not really, because we're in it again, and it's deeper, and it's more pervasive, and the base is much stronger. So how do we go forward? And those are the questions I'm asking myself, and I'm not alone, obviously, but I don't know if that helps or not, but that's where I find my grounding. Okay, how have my forebears done this in the past? Who are my lights? Will I see a change in my lifetime? I don't know. Do we have time on the planet? I don't know. But what would God have us do, right? What does the way of the cross look like?
I'm supposed to be asking the questions.
Right.
Okay, so here we are.
Here we are.
Can I suggest to you, we've got a kind of podium in a triangle. So you've set out your maturity, your growing to maturity as what we could call a responsible citizen,
right.
Aware of injustice, informed by Christian faith. Then on the kind of second side of the triangle, we've got your coming to prominence as a person with a posh title in a significant place.
Can I have one more thing before we go on? I had a really formative experience before I went to Minnesota that is responsible for a lot of who I am that we haven't talked about yet, and that is, I was the associate to a priest we called them rectors. Brilliant man who gave me a job when I was 9 months pregnant with our first child, which was a huge gift to me because in that era there weren't many of us who were childbearing women ordained. And we worked together for 5 years, and for the first several years it was a healthy and wonderful ministry. And then he began to unravel and really self-destruct. Now, the pattern of his behavior was way before I knew him, but it really started. And so I watched a leader take a community down by his own unintegrated self, if that makes sense. The kind of person for whom everything that's wrong is someone else's fault. Someone for whom, when the shadow cast over him, it cast over the whole community. And when the shadow lifted, everything was fine again. And when we tried to talk about the shadow time, he told us it was in our imagination. It was totally crazy making. And I had to figure out, I used to take notes to myself. If I ever become a rector, these are the things I'm not going to do, right? I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that. And I had to find a person or a methodology to help me make sense of that and to figure out how to be a leader without, I mean, I'm a broken sinner like anyone else, right? I've got all my flaws, all my contradictions, but how do I keep them from poisoning a community? And part of what I learned is you take responsibility for them, right? You own them, you work with them, you do your own work, and you try not to impose that on the people who are under your authority. And if I hadn't had that, I don't know that any of these other things would have. So I just wanted that to be in there because that was critical, and it came to me early, and I'm still working on it, but it helps give me a lens for the kinds of leaders that we see and the dangers of that lack of integration internally and what that does to a community or to a country. Okay, continue.
Okay, so we've got that first side of the triangle. Where was I?
I forget.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got that sense of responsible citizen. We've got that sense of mature leader, and the story you've just told informs how you exercise your authority as Bishop of Washington. And then the third side of the triangle is we've got this story you very helpfully narrated about America, which has come to a head.
Again.
Well, who knows where this is going, but
right.
Feels like it's come to a head very recently. So that, if we think of that as the triangle that you're operating within, there comes a moment when you cannot not say or do. That when you can no longer look over your shoulder and say, it's about time somebody said something must be done, somebody must do something, and you start looking around the room, there's fewer and fewer people in it, and there's you. Tell us about how that feels, what that did to you. Did you think, for such a time as this is my moment? Did you think, how did, and how, to what extent does that overlap with the January moment?
Right.
Or is the January moment part of a sort of a wider narrative?
That's a good question. A few things that were informative early on. One of the decisions I made was, as a leader, I would ground my engagement publicly with the congregations that I served, so that I was never out on my own, but I was part of the communities that I served. So we walked together. And we're not all of one mind, believe me, but we have a significant immigrant population, we have a significant LGBTQ population, we have a significant rural population, we got the whole thing, right? But I was going to stay grounded in the people. So that's been sort of my test. One of the ways that manifested early in the Trump administration was, the first one, was when he started attacking publicly. First, there were 4 women in the House of Representatives that were of immigrant descent, and he suggested that they go home, right? Remember that? And then he cast his eye on the city of Baltimore and spoke about Baltimore as a vermin-infested city. And Baltimore's about, 40-minute drive from Washington. And a friend of mine, who's a womanist African-American theologian, she called me up and she said, Mariann, somebody's got to say something, right? And so she and the dean and I crafted a statement about that moment. And we tried to pattern it on the Eugene McCarthy moment from the 50s. Sir, have you no decency, right? But we didn't direct we wrote an essay, we didn't direct it at the president, we directed it at the country, like, where is our decency? And the reason I mention that is that got a little bit of attention. Like, that put me in the public eye, on the news programs, there was just like a flurry, and so I had the sense, okay, this was a touch of it, and then it went away. In 2020, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, as you know, my home city. So I had a lot of friends, a son and his family in Minneapolis. And was watching the protests there, and one of my clergy colleagues was telling me how they were trying to build a presence of people in the marches to be a peaceful presence. And I thought, wow, that's great. And then within a day, all of the marches were in Washington, right? Like right in the city. And we have a church that's right across the street from the White House, right across from the park and the White House. And that became a staging ground for all of the protests. So I went down to the church, this was on a Sunday, and met with the senior warden. The rector happened to be on holiday. And we said, we're going to make a staging area. We're going to have water, and we're going to have masks. This was before vaccines. Like, we were all like, we're going to just be helpful, peaceful prayers. And then you may know what happened after that. There was a fire in the church, it was put out. The president decides he's going to make a statement or have a photo taken. So he walks across the park after having it forcibly cleared. That very day, having screamed at governors across the country for being cowards, and how he was threatening military force against those cities, right? So that all happened in a day. And then he's at front of St. John's Church holding up the Bible. Right? I was at home, I was with my mom. We just moved her into our house because of COVID. Paul was downstairs in the basement because we thought he had COVID. I'm watching this on the news, my phone is blowing up, right? So it was on my turf, right? It was like he was in my lane. And I didn't have a lot of time to think, but somebody said to me in that cauldron, people need to hear from somebody tonight. It's like, okay. And so that was another moment, right? And that lasted, that whole wave lasted a bit. But I felt moved to do it because it was so clear, right? It was so clearly an outrage. So I had my chops, I guess. I learned a bit about that. I also learned not to take it too seriously because waves like that come and go, right? So, you're in front of a lot of cameras one day and then they all go away, and oh, by the way, the garbage still needs to be taken out and the roof is still leaking in the church down the street and the warden and the rector down the road are still having the fight, and so life goes on, and life, so get back to your day job. And so that was a setup for January. It gave me some practice, and it also helped me claim my voice in a way that felt authentic. And the other thing, and just as an aside, that every once in a while, I was given the opportunity to preach at a really important funeral. I was allowed to offer the homily for Madeleine Albright's funeral, right? So I had a moment where I could actually try to put these ideas into practice in a way that said, okay, every now and again, as Bishop of Washington, so I better pay attention and do my homework and be ready when the moments come.
So when you stick your neck out like that, a number of things happen. You get huge compliments from people who you've never met, who don't really understand the context. You get vile attacks, including in this case from somebody quite senior. And then you get sinister things like some writing on your car, or somebody doing something to your tires, or somebody daubing something on a church. And then you just get that wobble where you think, hang on, what about my physical safety or my family? Or have you reached a point where you thought, hang on, I'm just in over my head here?
I don't know.
Oh, and by the way, when you get those last things, the people that wrote the nice messages, they're nowhere to be seen.
Right. Yeah, it's a bit scary, actually, to be on the receiving end of a lot of meanness, and it's a pretty mean back and forth in the U.S. right now. It didn't last that long, and I had so much support that I didn't feel personally afraid very often. So I mean, honestly, didn't feel, there were a couple of times. And I did have a few nights when I thought, I wonder what would happen if somebody showed up at our house and shot me, right? You know, it just occurred to me one night, I'm lying in my bed and I'm thinking, I wonder what would happen. And so I started thinking about that. It didn't last, right? But I have to confess, it crossed my mind. But it had the opposite effect. I told you this yesterday. Paul and I've been bishop for 14 years, and I was really planning on retiring next year. And starting the wheels of the succession process right now. And one of the things that this has convinced me of is that this is not the time. So it actually had the opposite effect. It's like, no, I think I actually have to stay in. Even if I do nothing, which I won't do, but I just felt like important, like just being. Sometimes you just have to stay standing. And I have felt that way many times in my life when I was the cause of my crisis, right? I've made so many mistakes, by the way, like so many mistakes. And I've had to own them publicly, and I've had to learn to come back from failure, and sometimes you're just like, okay, if I can just stay standing. And that muscle memory is what I'm leaning on right now, which is I think I just need to stay standing for a while. And I've asked God, and I really hope I receive an answer to this prayer. I've asked God to be really clear with me when it'll be okay for me to step down. I'd really like to be clear. The last thing I want to do is stay too long, but and so I'm just willing to wait for a while and just say, for now, I'm still standing. That's what I'm doing.
Now, I've got one more question for Bishop Mariann, and then it's over to you guys. So start thinking, start writing, start QR coding, start thinking about what it feels like to talk to that microphone there. Don't leave it till 29 minutes past 8 and then be cross with me that I haven't asked you to speak. We've got lots of time now. Okay, here's the last one from me, Bishop Mariann. What have you learnt from the experience of standing that might be helpful to the people sitting in front of you now and the people who you minister to in your diocese who are thinking, what on earth can I do?
Learned so many things. We aren't all called to stand in the same place in the same way. And so a lot of it depends where you are in the arc of your life, in the circumstances that you find yourself in at a given moment, the gifts that you have, the obligations around you. And so I never presume anything about anyone else where they're standing or not standing. So I think that's an internal sense. There is always the temptation, after having stood in a place and getting some of the tension you described, to imagine that we're supposed to be standing in that same dramatic way all the time. And I've learned that that's not true. There's actually a kind of a letdown that happens after the lights go away and life becomes normal again. And a sense, and maybe as writers and preachers in the room will understand, like, you were so brilliant last week. Why is it that you have absolutely nothing right now, right? How did that happen, that I was so great? You know, they thought I was great, and I have got nothing now. And I think that that's part of it. Like, some days you're called, and other days you're asked to just let someone else do it. So it's a yin and a yang. And so I pay attention to that for myself, and I pay attention and respect that of others. So I would ask you to ask yourself that question, right? Never to compare yourself to someone else, but where is God in your life, and what is the call? Let's see if there's anything else I've learned. It's not about me.
Over to you guys. Otherwise, you know what happens. I go on asking questions. So here, oh, they're coming. Here we go. Go on. I'll take a couple at a time.
Hi, I'm Susan. I lived in Minnesota for years. I have actually tasted lutefisk. couldn't swallow it, but I tasted it.
Nor can I.
I know you said, addressed what's happening in America, the decisions that people are making that don't seem like the decisions that Americans make. And while you addressed some of the history, I remember visiting Senator from Michigan told us...
Keep it short, Susan,
okay,
please.
Said that parents can't afford to send their kids to summer camp anymore. Is it the economy? Is that what's happening in people's daily lives that's leading people to make these decisions?
Thank you.
Great question.
Thank you. We're going to take two more at the same time and invite Bishop Mariann to pick the bones out of them.
Thank you for what you've shared. The church has a long history of being involved in politics, often for good, often for ill. How can the church engage well in politics without being drawn into the murkier elements of power? And please consider this an implied compliment, not a veiled criticism.
Could you say that?
Thank you. So it's a compliment, not a veiled criticism. The question. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bishop Mariann, for being here and all that you've encouraged in us. Your story of discernment resonates with me, and yesterday, you'll be aware, there was far-right marches in London, anti-immigration.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to Christian leaders in the UK right now?
Okay. Could we take those three? The
Sure.
economy?
This will be quick. The first question about income inequality, I think that should be a no-brainer for all of us, right? The income inequality is a disaster of global proportion, and we have so much to answer for in that, and that it breeds it. So that, and then also a very real sense on the part of people across the country, some in my own family, that they have been the subject of disdain and ridicule and contempt for years, and that people like me see them as stupid or backward, prejudiced, racist, homophobic. They're sick of it, right? But the income and disparity, if we don't solve that around the country and around the world, I think we will always be. The irony is, of course, that the concentration of wealth is being exacerbated by the very people that have been elected to. So that's that. It's hard. It's really hard.
Questions in politics?
But it's right. Well, like all people, we're going to do politics imperfectly, often badly, working more out of our self-interest than we perhaps would want to admit. So let's just name that. There's always a suspicion, especially in America, when religious leaders get too involved in politics, but at the same time, we're missed when we're not. Right now, we're so represented across the spectrum that we're just like everybody else. And so we have to be careful. I think we have to be humble. We have to be clear. My measuring stick is for what end, right? Is it for the good of the whole? Is it for the good of all people? Is it for the cause of rectifying some of the things that I've just mentioned? Are we better? Are we contributing to good? Those are my benchmarks. There are a lot of ways that we're involved in that are not those things. And frankly, the Episcopal Church has a lot to answer for on that one. We have a lot to answer for, so.
Anything about far-right marches?
It feels very similar to what we're experiencing on a not quite as intense and ugly scale. So I don't, your context is your context, and so understanding that, I get tired of my ideological and theological allies simplifying our adversaries and caricaturing them in the ways that belittle them. I'm tired of that. So I'm challenging us to try and understand. We don't have to agree, and we may, but I just think we should understand. And so I work pretty hard to try to understand. I may not be able to fix it, but if I don't, so I guess I would say, what do you know? What can you see? And what are the sources of inspiration that guide you? And maybe we're all in for a ride for the next decade, in which case let's stay friends, please, across the Atlantic.
Okay, well, let's take one from online and two more from the room.
A question from online, which has been upvoted the most, so you must be popular, is, would you like to be the Archbishop of Canterbury?
No, thank you.
Next question, Sean.
Thank you, Bishop Mariann, for your wonderful sermon this morning, for your prayers of intercession from your talk with Sam earlier, and for this evening's talk. I hope we're not overworking you, and we're very grateful that you're here. My question to you is, what is the average American's view of what is happening at the moment in the Middle East? Here in Europe, we look on...
In the Middle East, you said?
In the Middle East, in the Holy Land. In Israel and the Gaza Strip.
Can we leave it there, Sean? Because it's a great question.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great question. We want to hear the answer. Okay. Can we take two more, please?
My name's Divian. I just wanted to say thank you so much. Not a question, just a comment, because a voice like yours, when we heard it in January, it meant so much to us. So whatever it took, being brave, whatever it took, whatever brought you to that point, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. It meant a huge amount.
Thank you.
Very much reiterate those thanks and gratitude. I'm inspired to ask this question because you mentioned both the Catholic worker movement and the Quakers when you started, both religious movements, faith-based movements opposed to militarism and in support of peace. You might know that almost 2,000 people have been arrested in the last few months, not very far from here in Parliament Square, opposing the genocide and opposing and in support of a movement that's taken non-violent direct action to try and end that and to bring exposure to militarism, much like the Catholic workers do in the United States. I don't want you to say anything about the specifics, but I wondered if you might say something to those people of conscience who've been arrested, many of them people of faith, some of them clergy, just in terms of spiritual direction, because they're all facing a very serious, potentially life-changing consequences for their action. And it'd be great to hear from you.
Thank you. So, question about the Middle East and the more specific question about direct action.
Nothing has divided the American populace more than the question of Israel-Palestine, and particularly on the left. It's just torn us apart. And so it had enormous consequences. It has enormous consequences for the country, and it's just devastating. And so we live this, and it's been going on for years, right? Long before October 7th, a few years ago. It's just always been the rise of anti-Semitism is also a real factor in American society, and so that those two things and all of the tensions that that evokes. And so it is almost impossible for us to have a conversation about the situation in Gaza. It's excruciating. I am among those who I could share with you my views, and I think you would find, most of you would find them to be sympathetic, extremely so, to the people of Palestine. And yet, I have so many Jewish friends and colleagues that I am in constant relationship with, and I am often experienced as being too soft on them as representatives of the Jewish people in our country. And so we try to find a way to be in conversation with each other about what we can do to help bring about an end to the genocide and to the destruction not only of the Palestinian people, but of the ideals of the Israeli state. So I'll leave it there. It's awful. And I wonder sometimes, I just wonder, like, what is the most effective, what can we do? And I have chosen not to join those who are willing to shut or wanting to just bring this to the fore at every moment, because I'm trying to hold a lot of things at the same time, which frustrates people. And I'm sure maybe frustrating you, but it's just the reality that we're holding so much right now. And when President Trump was elected, I felt the deepest pit in my stomach, because I knew that this would empower the Israeli government in ways that would keep this war going. But there we have it, and so there's that. To those pacifists who are putting their lives and bodies on the line for what they believe, I hold them in the highest esteem. I also know that the pacifist cause is dependent upon people who take that action and are willing to pay the consequence, right? That's part of the deal. And so it is terrifying. It is very brave. It is often perceived in the beginning as a failure. And so all of those things are true. And so for those who are walking that path, I simply say, be of good courage. If that is the path to which God has called you, you are walking it, and you're doing so faithfully. Not everyone can walk it for all the reasons that you know, but they're doing it. And I think we owe them a great debt of gratitude. So, thank you.
Okay. Let's have a couple more from the world, and then one more from the building. Two more from the world, if that's all right, to right the balance a bit. One more from the building.
As an American, how do you wake up every day with any kind of hope?
Okay.
And there's a few questions on this theme, so I'll try to bring them together, but it's about how the right wing has sort of uses the name of Jesus to justify what they do, and how we cope with this as a church, and any advice you have for churches, particularly seeing a growth in churches, it says here, primarily conservative men with Gen Z returning to church. Do you think there's a way to prevent Christianity becoming a way to justify right-wing rhetoric?
Thank you. And one more from the building.
My question follows on from what you just said. I fear in the Western world the church is becoming largely irrelevant to mainstream. I worry about the social media, and everybody is so quick to make judgments and opinions, and everybody's attention spans are so short. We don't listen to each other's stories. My question is, how can we, as people in this community who care, how can we encourage listening to other people's stories? Because I think that's where change will start to happen.
Okay. Hope? right-wingism and listening.
A lot of American life hasn't changed, right? We still send our children to school. We still go to their soccer games, go to the movies. We have dinner with our friends, right? There are a lot of, the sun rises and it's gorgeous. There's a good cup of coffee in the morning. There's a lot of joy to be found in daily life, no matter who's in control of your government. And now, that's not true for everyone. You know, for some people right now, life is really miserable. And so you have that vicarious sense of suffering and responsibility all the time, which I find very difficult. And when I hear my grandson's voice on the other end of the phone, yeah, it makes my day. So I'm not going to let the current environment take that away, because otherwise I become, as St. Paul said, a noisy gong and a clangy cymbal, right? If I can't love, if I can't shield the joyous, as the collect I offered this evening says, you know, there's just something to be said about relishing life. And believe me, people in much harder situations are way better at that than many of us. And so learning how to do that is one way. I also think hope is a discipline. It's not only a feeling. It is for Christians, it's kind of non-negotiable. I mean, it's just what we're called to. And we're given a vision of hope that isn't Pollyanna. It's pretty gritty. And it's a gift. Sometimes I feel it, sometimes I don't, but I'm going to live in hope on, you know, in and out of season, right? That's just, and some days I'm better at it than others, but most mornings, not every morning, and I pray for hope. I ask it as a charism, a gift, so that I might not add to the weight of other people's lives, right? People have enough to carry. They don't need my cynicism. They don't need my snarky opinion. They don't need my doomsday analysis, even if I'm feeling it, right? It doesn't take any effort at all. That's just easy, right? It takes no energy at all to be negative right now, to be cynical, to be hopeless. But to be hope-filled, to see the good in people, even those you disagree with, that takes a bit of effort. It's worthy of a life, I think. In terms of what you were saying about the rural areas and about listening to people's stories, Brian Stevenson is a real model for me, civil rights lawyer, death penalty abolisher, and he talks about proximity to suffering, right? You have to know people. That means you have to be close to them. So we may talk about the rural areas, right? If you're not living in a rural area, know your neighbors, right? It's a thing, it's not a community. They're not people. We have friends in Minnesota that moved to a very rural area. They're probably the only blue dot in a very red corner of the state, and they are friends with everybody. They go to the local bar every week and pay Trivial Pursuit, and they know all the business people, and they are just there, right? And I think that's an inspiration to me. So that's what I would say is a way forward. And by the way, we may not win, like the right-wing thing. Things may wash over us for a time, right? Sometimes it's like a wave. It just washes over a country. But so who's going to be standing when we get knocked down? Who's going to rise up? Who's going to be there to? Some of us will be. And I hope we can rise to that when the moment comes.
So Jesus is a rubber stamp for a right-wing agenda?
Oh, well, right. So like, what's new there, right? I mean, our Civil War, right? The justification of slavery, justification of colonization. I mean, that's of everything, right? I mean, Jesus is, that's one of the reasons why self-awareness and maturity and all the things we were talking about are so important because we latch on to Jesus to the level of our own understanding. So why would we be surprised about that? The thing is, right now, we don't have a very loud microphone in the world. And we're out organized, we're out funded, we're out strategized. I think Reinhold Niebuhr talked about that back in the 40s and 50s. And I think it was Desmond Tutu said that too once. He said, you know, someone asked him a similar question. Isn't it true, Archbishop, that hate is much, as a force, is just much stronger than love? And he said, oh, no. You know, can you say, oh, no. Love is much stronger than hate. But hate is better organized, he said. And so maybe we have to be as wise as serpents sometimes, but so I'm just going to stick with love. You know, I think I'm just going to stick with love and try to get smart about it, you know. And I will say, and I said this yesterday at this Festival of Preaching, even your response, still 9 months on from the sermon in January, when a message like that, you know, pretty basic, simple message about Christian mercy and honesty, integrity, decency, right? Pretty standard fare, penetrated the public arena. It was news. And it was received so gratefully. That should tell us something about the importance of who we are and what we do. And sometimes you have a microphone, and sometimes you have the warmth of your smile, and something in between. So we shouldn't take that for granted, right?
Anything about listening?
Anything about what?
Listening. Last question.
That's what I meant about proximity, you know, and relationship building. We're not going to change. We're not going to win by yelling louder, right? It's not how it's going to work. We're not going to out-yell. We're going to have to win by sacrificial love.
Thank you. Let's take 2 more from the building and maybe 1 from the world.
So I'll keep the question brief, but just to say that I wasn't intending on being here this evening. I'd been to Newbury and was on my way home, and I got to St Pancras Station and decided to go for a walk and ended up here. But over the weekend I'd had I've been on a bit of a journey towards calling, and had decided this weekend that I wasn't going to carry on. I think God might be on my case. And so I was just going to ask you, because basically things were going great, and then it's when, I think you said about, I wrote it down, moving from staying, so it's that thing of staying and the monastic stability. And I think I understand that, but then when conflict hits, it's sort of how you move through that. And I know that's quite a personal question, but I think it probably has got a bigger, it is probably a bigger thing in communities, churches, the countries, you know, that thing of stability. Right. But then when conflict hits, and you get hurt by things, right, and you decide.
Thank you for the question. It's a beautiful question. That's good.
Yeah.
No, that's good. Okay. Just give everyone else a chance to ask the question, but staying and moving through conflict. Thank you.
Bishop Mariann, thank you. All about love is the question I wanted to ask. So, love to us is not a new story. It is part of our story. Similarly, hate is also not a new story. It is part of our story. And I know you spoke about love. So, how can we increase love in the hearts of those that have hatred in it? And is it our job to do so? Thank you.
Okay, one from the...
And there was a question online about any advice you would have for a young person who is seeking a relationship with God, having not previously been particularly interested in the church, and what advice you would have for someone starting out on that journey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all so much for these questions. Let me talk about the first one and say, if anyone feels that their personal safety is at issue, it's perfectly appropriate to seek safety. And I would, if I were among your circle of loved ones, I would encourage that. Right? I have several colleagues, young clergy, who have accepted positions in Canada because they just didn't feel safe in the U.S., and I don't blame them. So there's that. I don't think. So I just want to name that when conflict intensifies, seeking safety is a good thing. And also, sometimes we're stronger than we realize, and we learn things from standing in the storm. And sometimes we learn things about God as we strive to just hold on. So all those things, in whatever configuration that happens in your life and mine, and those we love. The second question was about, hateful
Yeah,
people
love. How
and
do you
love.
teach love?
No, I don't think we're responsible for hateful people and trying to turn them into loving people. I don't think so. I don't think we have that kind of power. God is the one who moves in the human heart. What we can do is be who we are and seek to embody what we embody. And I have a number of friends of color particularly, who are really tired of having to be the ones to teach white people how to be decent human beings, right? They're sick of it. It's like, okay, I get it, right? And so, I think it's where your sense of call is and what you feel the relationships are. We need some people who are willing to be in relationship and teach one another, but you have to be open to experiencing that. And so what breaks a person open to look at, as Sam was saying earlier this evening, what changes a person's mind? I mean, what changes a person's mind? What changes a person's heart? It's rarely a good debate, sometimes, but it's usually a crisis, a relationship, a gift. What's changed you? And maybe we need to have a little bit of mercy for people who are caught up in a spiral that they can't get their way out of, and they may do real damage while they're in it, as have we in such times. So it's a mystery how we change. But I don't want to give up on anybody, and I don't necessarily want to see people, as again Brian Stevens said, we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. Every person is more than the worst thing we do or think or say. We're more than that, every single one of us. And let's work on that and build from there.
Becoming a Christian.
Oh. Well, Rowan Williams is coming tomorrow, and he said something that I'd like to offer. He said once that God is far more interested in us than we realize. So to anyone who is wondering how to explore a relationship with God, rest assured and be confident that God is utterly fascinated with you and is already with you in ways that you just are about to discover by asking the question. And be sure to pay attention to what comes your way, because the Spirit is moving. And if there are good people around you that you can talk to, whose lives or whose faith draws you in, follow that, because you are about to embark on a wonderful journey. You're about to discover the journey that you've been on and how God has been with you all along.
Okay, we got 2 more in the room. I need 1 sentence from each of you and 1 sentence replies from Bishop Mariann, if it's not too bold to ask. We do need to keep our promises about when we finish.
Yes.
1 sentence, please.
Thank you. You are such a beautiful representation of age as expansion and not decline. Can you say a word of empowerment and encouragement for people who are growing into their later years and may not feel as powerful and as strong as you are?
Of course.
People in their later years. Bernard, what last word?
As a 21-year-old student in Minnesota, I learned point trajectory theory. What point in the trajectory do you think we are at the moment?
The spiritual tasks of eldership are many, and they require great courage, and they allow for deep connection and possibility with others. So I would say to all of us in our elder years that great things are ahead, and power looks different, but it is not the less for it.
Stop there.
What was the other one?
About the points from Minnesota.
I don't know that theory, so
Okay. Okay, I've got a few things to say. Number 1, fill in your evaluation sheets. If you give Bishop Mariann 10 out of 10, she might come back, you never know. But tell us what you found helpful, less helpful about this evening. Please join us downstairs in the crypt for yummies and goodies and chat, and you might get to talk to Bishop Mariann face to face, and you might get to buy all of the books of hers that we have in stock, and she might sign 1 or 2 of them, who knows. So do come and join us downstairs. Join us again tomorrow for Rowan Williams, who is always a treat. And I've just got one more thing to say, which is that if you look in the book of Proverbs, in the Washington, D.C. translation, you'll find something that goes a little bit like this. A woman of valor, who can find? She is rooted in her communities, and she stays close to people in pain. She cultivates love in her relationships, and she continues to listen to and seek to understand people who have views and identities very different from her own. She learns to exercise power with dignity and courage and integrity. She learns from her own mistakes and owns up to them, and she learns from the mistakes of those around her and holds them accountable. She comes to a country far away, and she offers an example of hope and inspiration and courage and transformation. Tonight we have met a woman of valor. Please join me in thanking Bishop Mariann Budde.